4 in the morning, the South China Sea. USS Abraham Lincoln was cutting through a 3-meter swell at a steady 20 knots. The massive nuclear-powered aircraft carrier was running with its lights dimmed, but its electronic eyes were wide open and fixed on the horizon. Something was moving across the dark water that did not belong to the normal flow of commercial traffic. 60 miles from the nearest coast, the Carrier Strike Group's outer defensive screen had just registered a signature that changed the nature of the night. The air over the flight deck was thick with the smell of salt spray and the faint, ozone tang of high-powered radar arrays working at maximum capacity. High above the carrier, orbiting at 25,000 feet, an E-2 Charlie Hawkeye early warning aircraft had been the first to see the change. The radar operators inside the cramped, vibrating fuselage watched as 24 small, high-speed contacts detached themselves from the coastal clutter and began to move toward the center of the South China Sea. These were not fishing vessels or merchant tankers. Their speed was 45 knots and climbing. Their formation was tight, disciplined, and aggressive. The Hawkeye crew immediately relayed the data to the Combat Direction Center deep within the hull of the Lincoln. Bridge, combat. We have multiple high-speed surface contacts, bearing 320, range 40 miles, and closing. The voice over the internal communications loop was calm, practiced, and professional. On the bridge of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the commanding officer stepped toward the forward windows. The sea was a black void, the horizon invisible under a heavy layer of overcast clouds. To the naked eye, there was nothing but darkness. On the tactical displays, however, the world was bleeding red. The signatures belonged to Type 022 Hubei-class fast attack craft. These were small, catamaran-style vessels, designed for high speed and packed with 8 anti-ship cruise missiles each. Individually, they were a nuisance to a carrier. In a group of 24, they were a saturation threat designed to overwhelm even the most advanced Aegis defense systems. They were moving in a classic swarm pattern, spreading out to approach from multiple angles simultaneously. Signal the escort screen. Tell the destroyer DDG-87 and the cruiser CG-62 to move to intercept positions, the commanding officer ordered. And set general quarters. I want every man and woman on this ship at their station 5 minutes ago. The alarm began to pulse. Through the passageways of the carrier, a rhythmic, piercing electronic gong that signaled the end of the night's routine. Across the 4.5 acres of the flight deck, the yellow-shirted aircraft handlers and green-shirted maintenance crews scrambled. Below decks, thousands of sailors rolled out of their racks, pulling on fire-retardant flash gear and sprinting to their assigned positions. The massive steel doors of the ammunition magazines were unbolted, and the elevators began the slow, heavy lift of bringing missiles and shells to the surface. At latitude 15 degrees 40 minutes north and longitude 115 degrees 12 minutes east, the USS Abraham Lincoln was no longer just a ship. It was a fortress transitioning into a combat footing. The rumble of the 4 massive steam turbines increased as the carrier began to put on speed, its wake turning into a boiling white road behind it. The destroyer, DDG-87, the USS Mason, moved to the carrier's port quarter, its own ANSPY-6 radar system locking onto the incoming swarm. The Mason was the first line of defense, a shield of steel and silicon. Its commander watched the range close to 30 miles. The Chinese fast attack boats were now within the outer envelope of their own missile systems. The question was no longer if they would attack, but when. The environment around the strike group felt charged with static. The wind began to pick up, whipping the Whitecaps into a frenzy as the carrier turned into the breeze to prepare for emergency flight operations. The sound of the ocean slamming against the hull was a constant, heavy thud, like a giant heart beating in the dark. Every sensor on the ship was now focused on those 24 red dots on the screen. They were small, fast, and deadly, and they were coming with a singular purpose: to find a gap in the armor of the most powerful ship in the United States Navy. The tactical officer reported that the lead fast attack boat had just crossed the 12-mile exclusion zone. This was the line in the sand. Warnings had been broadcast on all international frequencies, but the swarm had remained silent. No radio calls, no identification, just the steady, high-speed approach of 24 hulls cutting through the water. The tension in the Combat Direction Center was a physical weight. The crew knew the math. If 24 boats each launched 8 missiles, the carrier would face nearly 200 incoming targets at once. The defensive systems were good, but they were about to be tested to the point of failure. 4:20 in the morning. The South China Sea, 200 miles west of the Luzon Strait. Carrier Strike Group 3, led by the USS Abraham Lincoln, was navigating one of the most contested stretches of water on the planet. The tension that had been building for months over disputed territorial claims was no longer a matter of diplomatic cables and formal protests. It was now a physical presence on the radar screens of every American ship in the formation. The 24 Type 022 fast attack craft were not merely shadowing the fleet, they were executing a coordinated high-speed envelopment. The geopolitical context of this transit was rooted in a week of escalating naval posturing. The United States Navy had maintained a consistent presence in these waters to ensure the freedom of international trade routes. In response, the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy had deployed a massive surface-to-surface missile capability. For the last 48 hours, Chinese land-based radar had been illuminating the American ships with aggressive tracking pulses. Now, the move from land-based monitoring to sea-based aggression was complete. The swarm of catamaran-hulled boats represented a direct challenge to the sovereignty of the international waters. Inside the Combat Direction Center of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the tactical environment was a symphony of electronic data and controlled urgency. The air was chilled to exactly 65 degrees to protect the massive server banks, creating a sharp contrast to the humid, salt-heavy atmosphere on the flight deck. The low hum of the ventilation system was the only sound besides the measured voices of the radar operators. The tactical action officer watched as the 24 red icons on the main display split into 3 distinct groups of 8 vessels each. They were moving into a classic pincer formation, designed to force the American escorts to divide their attention. The northern group is accelerating to 52 knots, the surface warfare officer reported. They are on a direct intercept course with the destroyer DDG-87, the USS Mason. Range is now 15 miles. The commander of the strike group, aboard the cruiser CG-62, issued the first defensive orders. The rules of engagement were strict but clear. The American forces would not fire the first shot, but they would not allow the hostile vessels to reach a position where a missile launch could not be intercepted. The cruiser CG-62 and the destroyer DDG-87 began to maneuver outward, creating a wider defensive arc around the carrier. Their goal was to push the exclusion zone further away from the Lincoln, providing the carrier's own defense systems more time to react if the situation turned kinetic. On the flight deck of the Lincoln, the first EA-18 Golf Growler was catapulted into the darkness. The twin engines of the electronic warfare jet roared with a combined 36,000 pounds of thrust, the blue-white flame of the afterburners illuminating the spray-slick deck for a split second. Once airborne, the Growler began to orbit at 12,000 feet, its powerful jamming pods projecting a wall of electronic noise toward the incoming swarm. The objective was to blind the radar of the fast attack craft, making it impossible for them to achieve a stable targeting solution for their cruise missiles. The sea between the two forces was now a chaotic landscape of whitecaps and dark troughs. The Type 022 boats were designed for these conditions, their twin hulls cutting through the 3-meter swells with minimal loss of speed. The smell of diesel exhaust from the swarm's high-speed engines began to drift toward the American screen, carried by the damp morning wind. The distance was closing at a rate of nearly 1 mile every minute. At 4:35 in the morning, the lead Chinese boat in the northern group crossed the 10-mile threshold. The destroyer DDG-87 responded by illuminating the vessel with its fire control radar, a clear signal that a weapon system was locked and ready to fire. This was the final electronic warning. The bridge of the Mason broadcast a final message over the bridge-to-bridge radio frequency. stating that the Chinese vessels were approaching a high-value United States Navy asset and must turn away immediately or face defensive action. The response from the swarm was a sudden, synchronized increase in speed across all 24 hulls. The Chinese boats did not turn away. Instead, they began to weave in a zigzag pattern, a tactic used to make radar tracking more difficult for the American guns. The tactical action officer on the Lincoln realized that the time for warnings had passed. The swarm was no longer posturing. They were preparing for a breach. Bridge. Combat. The tactical officer's voice was steady. The northern group has reached the 9-mile mark. They are ignoring all warnings. Recommend transitioning to weapon-ready status for the port-side close-in weapon systems. The commanding officer of the Lincoln gave the order. The massive carrier was now a hornet's nest of activity. The 5,000 sailors on board were at their stations, and the ship's automated defense systems were brought online. The threat was no longer a theoretical exercise. The breach was about to begin, and the American fleet was ready to meet it with the full weight of its technological superiority. 4:40 in the morning. The outer defensive screen of Carrier Strike Group 3, the cruiser CG-62 and the destroyer DDG-87 were now positioned 5 miles ahead of the carrier's bow, acting as the steel gatekeepers for the USS Abraham Lincoln. The two ships were slicing through the rising swells at 28 knots, their hulls shuddering as they crested the dark waves. On the bridge of the destroyer DDG-87, the commanding officer watched the infrared feed of the incoming Chinese swarm. The catamaran hulls of the Type 022 boats were visible as glowing white ghosts against the cold black of the sea. They were now less than 7 miles from the American escorts, and they were not slowing down. The tactical situation was centered at coordinates 14 degrees 32 minutes north, 115 degrees 24 minutes east. The cruiser CG-62 took the lead in the non-lethal escalation phase. The ship's long-range acoustic devices were aimed at the closest group of 4 fast attack boats, projecting a narrow beam of high-intensity, painful sound across the water. Simultaneously, high-powered green laser dazzlers were activated, bathing the bridges of the Chinese vessels in a flickering, blinding light designed to make visual navigation and manual weapon aiming nearly impossible. The sea between the two forces was suddenly cut by these pillars of artificial light, reflecting off the whitecaps in a surreal display of electronic warfare. Target Group 1 is maintaining course and speed. The dazzlers are having no visible effect on their formation, the electronic warfare officer reported on the DDG-87. They are likely operating under automated pilot or closed-circuit television guidance. They are ignoring the acoustic warnings entirely. The commander of the strike group authorized the transition to kinetic warning fire. This was a critical moment in the rules of engagement. The goal was to demonstrate the absolute resolve of the United States Navy without initiating a full-scale exchange of anti-ship missiles. The forward 5-inch Mark 45 lightweight gun on the destroyer DDG-87 swung toward the horizon, its barrel slaved to the optical sensors of the Aegis fire control system. The mount moved with a predatory, mechanical fluidness, tracking a point exactly 500 yards ahead of the lead Chinese boat. The first shot was a dull, heavy thud that vibrated through the entire hull of the destroyer. A flash of orange flame erupted from the muzzle, followed by a dense cloud of white smoke that was instantly torn away by the wind. 3 seconds later, a massive pillar of water erupted from the sea, directly in the path of the lead catamaran. The 5-inch shell, fused to impact the water, sent a wall of spray 50 feet into the air. The Chinese boat did not flinch. It drove straight through the falling mist, its engines screaming at full throttle. The cruiser CG-62 joined the barrage, its 2 5-inch guns firing in a synchronized rhythm. For 3 minutes, the dark morning was punctuated by the rhythmic flashes of the heavy guns. The American escorts were laying down a wall of water ahead of the swarm, firing a total of 48 rounds of high-explosive ammunition. The air around the ships began to smell of acrid cordite and burnt propellant, a sharp chemical scent that signaled the transition from patrol to combat. Despite the display of force, the 24 Chinese boats remained in their tight pincer formation, closing the distance to 6 miles. They are testing our nerve, the commanding officer of the DDG-87 muttered, his hands gripped tight on the edge of the tactical console. They know we won't fire directly on them until they launch. They're using that against us to get inside the minimum engagement range of our primary missiles. Tactically, the swarm was now executing a high-speed split maneuver. The northern and southern groups of 8 boats each began to veer wide, attempting to bypass the escorts and reach the carrier's flanks. The central group of 8 boats slowed down slightly, acting as a decoy to keep the attention of the cruiser and destroyer fixed on the front. It was a sophisticated, multi-axis approach that exploited the fact that even 2 Aegis-equipped ships could not be everywhere at once. The environment was now a chaotic mix of spray, smoke, and electronic noise. The wind had increased to 25 knots, and the sea was becoming increasingly violent. On the deck of the cruiser CG-62, the sailors manning the 25mm Mark 38 machine guns checked their ammunition belts. They were the last line of defense before the swarm reached the carrier's hull. The outer screen was being stretched to its breaking point. The warning phase had failed. The Chinese boats were now within 5 miles of the USS Abraham Lincoln, and the tactical displays showed them beginning to arm their surface-to-surface missile seekers. Bridge. Combat. The voice of the tactical action officer was urgent. The southern group has broken past the DDG-87's intercept zone. They have a clear line of sight to the carrier's stern. We are losing the perimeter. 4:45 in the morning. The South China Sea. At coordinates 14 degrees 38 minutes north and 115 degrees 30 minutes east, the tactical integrity of Carrier Strike Group 3 was beginning to fracture. The southern group of 8 Chinese Type 022 fast attack boats had successfully exploited a gap in the defensive geometry. By utilizing the heavy 3-meter swells as a form of natural terrain masking, the catamaran-hulled vessels had remained in the radar trough just long enough to bypass the primary intercept course of the destroyer DDG-87. The breach was not a failure of American technology, but a testament to the brutal mathematics of swarm tactics. While the cruiser CG-62 was occupied with the central decoy group and the destroyer DDG-87 was attempting to manage the northern pincer, the southern 8 boats had pushed their engines to the absolute limit. They were now moving at 55 knots, their twin hulls throwing up massive rooster tails of white spray that were visible on the carrier's high-resolution infrared cameras. They had entered the inner bubble, the 5-mile zone, where long-range missiles were no longer the primary solution, and the defense shifted to the carrier's own organic weapon systems. Inside the Combat Direction Center of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the atmosphere had shifted from calculated observation to high-stakes crisis management. The low-frequency hum of the ship's 2 nuclear reactors vibrated through the deck plates, a constant reminder of the massive power being surged into the carrier's propulsion and sensor suites. The tactical action officer stood behind the surface warfare console, his eyes fixed on the blinking red icons that were now less than 4 miles from the ship's starboard quarter. Bridge. Combat. Southern group has breached the escort line. Range 3.8 miles. They are within the minimum engagement envelope for the Mark 41 vertical launch systems on the escorts. The Lincoln is now the primary target, the officer reported. The commanding officer of the Lincoln looked out from the bridge wing. The sky was just beginning to turn a bruised, dark purple as the first hint of pre-dawn light touched the horizon. Through his binoculars, he could finally see them low, jagged shapes cutting through the black water like sharks. The smell of the ocean was now joined by the acrid, heavy scent of diesel exhaust drifting from the closing swarm. The sound of the wind, screaming at 30 knots over the carrier's flight deck, seemed to amplify the urgency of the moment. The tactical reality of a breach meant that the carrier was no longer being protected by a shield, it was now a target that had to defend its own skin. The Type 022 boats were specifically designed for this. At a range of less than 4 miles, their YJ-83 anti-ship missiles would have a flight time of less than 20 seconds. This short-range saturation was intended to overwhelm the carrier's automated point defense systems. If all 8 boats in the southern group fired their full complement, the Lincoln would face 64 incoming missiles from a single vector, all arriving simultaneously. Activate the SLQ-32 electronic warfare suite. Full active jamming on all surface search frequencies, the commanding officer ordered, and I want the port and starboard Mark 38 gun crews in their seats. Weapons free as soon as they have a positive visual on the carrier's various weapon sponsons. The Mark 38 25mm chain guns began to slew toward the threat. These were stabilized, remote-operated cannons capable of firing 200 rounds per minute. Beside them, the RIM-116 rolling airframe missile launchers turned their honeycomb-like faces toward the south. These missiles were the carrier's primary defense against incoming cruise missiles, designed to roll in flight to maintain stability and lock onto the heat signatures of the attacking weapons. The environment was now one of extreme sensory overload. The Lincoln was heeling hard to port as it executed a high-speed turn, attempting to present its most heavily armored and best defended side to the incoming swarm. The sound of the hull straining against the massive weight of the turn was like the groaning of a living thing. On the flight deck, the final Super Hornets of the emergency launch were being hooked to the catapults, the steam rising from the deck in ghostly white plumes that were whipped away by the wind. The distance was now 3 miles. The lead Chinese boat, designated Target Alpha, suddenly altered its profile. A flash of white light erupted from its deck, the unmistakable signature of a missile booster ignition. The swarm was no longer just closing. They had started the engagement. Vampire! Vampire! Missile launch detected from the southern group, the tactical officer shouted. The breach was complete. The battle had moved from a tactical standoff to a kinetic exchange. The carrier was now fighting for its life, in the dark, and the next 60 seconds would determine the fate of the 5,000 souls on board. 4:47 in the morning. The South China Sea. The space between the USS Abraham Lincoln and the southern group of Chinese fast attack craft was no longer an empty stretch of ocean. It was a corridor of fire. The first YJ-83 anti-ship missile had cleared its launcher, its solid fuel booster creating a blinding white arc in the darkness. 2 seconds later, 7 more followed, their sea-skimming profiles dropping to just 5 meters above the waves as they accelerated to Mach 0.9. At a range of less than 3 miles, the flight time to the carrier's hull was calculated in heartbeats. Inside the Combat Direction Center, the order was given for the starboard point defense systems to go to automatic engage status. The Lincoln's massive hull shuddered as the ship's defensive systems took control of the battle. The air around the carrier's weapon sponsons was instantly filled with the sharp, chemical bite of burning missile propellant and the heavy, mechanical scent of hot lubricant from the rotating gun mounts. The RIM-116 rolling airframe missile launcher on the forward starboard sponson shrieked as its first cell ignited. The missile leaped from the launcher with a high-pitched scream, a white column of fire punching backward through the morning mist. The heat blast washed across the faces of the sailors stationed in the nearby passageways, even through the heavy steel hatches. The interceptor spun rapidly as it left the rail, its infrared seeker locking onto the heat signature of the incoming Chinese cruise missile. 400 yards off the starboard beam, the two weapons collided. The warhead of the rolling airframe missile punched straight into the nose of the YJ-83, detonating the anti-ship missile's high-explosive charge. A fireball that bleached the sky white erupted over the water, the shockwave slamming into the side of the carrier with a sound that cracked eardrums. Fragments of burning aluminum and jagged steel were sent flying across the surface of the sea, hissing as they hit the water. Before the smoke from the first intercept could clear, the carrier's Mark 38 25mm chain guns opened fire. The sound was a continuous, rhythmic thudding that vibrated through the deck plates and into the soles of every sailor's boots. The tracer rounds, glowing a bright, angry red, reached out like long fingers to find the lead Chinese fast attack boat. The 25mm rounds, traveling at 1100 meters per second, tore through the light aluminum hull of the catamaran. The warheads drove into the vessel's engine room, shattering the high-speed diesel blocks and severing fuel lines instantly. The lead Chinese boat erupted into a localized sun. The fuel tanks ignited, and the vessel came apart in a single, violent flash. The bridge section was lifted straight off the hull, rising 6 meters into the air before it fell back into the churning wake of the remaining boats. The two hulls of the catamaran split along the weld seams, and the boat began to sink stern first into the dark water. The remaining 7 Chinese vessels in the southern group recoiled from the destruction, their formation breaking in panic as they swerved to avoid the burning wreckage of their leader. Black, oily smoke boiled out of the water, rising in a dense column that blotted out the horizon for 3 full seconds. The immediate aftermath was a chaotic landscape of fire and metal. The sea was littered with burning debris, and the air was thick with the smell of scorched paint and ozone. But the engagement was far from over. As the southern group scrambled to regroup, 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters, which had been loitering on the carrier's starboard side, dove toward the surface. Their door-mounted machine guns began to spit lines of fire, and the pilots armed their AGM-114 Hellfire missiles. At latitude 14 degrees 40 minutes north and longitude 115 degrees 32 minutes east, the USS Abraham Lincoln was now fully engaged. The carrier's speed had increased to 32 knots, its 4 massive bronze propellers churning the sea into a frothing white road. The tactical display showed that while the southern breach had been blunted, the northern and central groups were now beginning their own terminal runs. The carrier's kill zone was working, but the sheer volume of incoming targets was pushing the system to its limit. The sailors manning the close-in weapon systems watched their ammunition counters spin down with terrifying speed. Every time a Chinese boat was destroyed, another seemed to emerge from the spray to take its place. This was the reality of the swarm. It was a monster with 24 heads, and the Lincoln had only just severed the first. 5 in the morning. The South China Sea. While the outer hull of the USS Abraham Lincoln was ringed by the fire of point defense systems, the interior of the ship was a landscape of industrial urgency and disciplined chaos. The engagement had already consumed a significant portion of the carrier's ready service ammunition. Deep within the steel bowels of the ship, in the high-security magazines, located 7 decks below the waterline, the ordnance handling teams were working at a pace that pushed the limits of human endurance. The air here was cool and filtered, but it carried the sharp, metallic scent of heavy machinery and the faint, sweet smell of hydraulic fluid. The carrier's logistic tail was now its most critical vulnerability. Each rolling airframe missile launcher had 21 cells, and several had already been emptied during the initial southern breach. The replenishment process was a feat of synchronized movement. Teams of sailors, wearing colored jerseys that designated their roles, moved with practiced precision. They used overhead hoists to lift the 2,000-pound missile canisters from their storage racks, guiding them onto specialized carts. The deck beneath their feet shuddered periodically as the ship's 5-inch guns on the escorting cruiser continued to fire, but no one looked up. "Keep it moving. We have 4 more pallets for the forward starboard sponson," the ordnance officer shouted over the hum of the high-speed elevators. The elevators, massive platforms capable of moving tens of thousands of pounds of explosives in seconds, were the circulatory system of the battle. As the empty launchers on the surface signaled their status to the Combat Direction Center, the magazines responded. This was the unseen side of modern naval warfare, the grueling, physical labor required to keep the high-tech sensors and missiles fed. Every sailor knew that a 30-second delay in the magazine could result in a hole in the ship's hull 5 minutes later. Up on the flight deck, the environment was even more intense. The wind was screaming across the 4.5 acres of steel, carrying the deafening roar of jet engines and the stinging spray of the sea. The ship was maintaining its combat air patrol, but the mission had shifted. The FA-18 Super Hornets and FA-18 Golf Growlers were no longer just loitering. They were being turned and hot refueled with the engines still running. The purple shirts, the aviation fuel handlers, dragged heavy hoses across the deck, connecting them to the bellies of the aircraft while the red shirts worked to hang fresh AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles and AGM-88 HARM missiles on the wing pylons. The heat from the jet exhaust was intense enough to distort the air, turning the silhouettes of the sailors into shimmering ghosts against the pre-dawn light. Logistics also extended to the ship's medical and repair teams. In the hangar bay, damage control parties stood by with their heavy silver fire suits and oxygen tanks, their eyes fixed on the overhead monitors showing the live feed from the starboard cameras. In the ship's primary medical ward, doctors and corpsmen prepared for casualties that had not yet arrived, laying out trauma kits and checking blood supplies. The professional silence of the ward was a stark contrast to the mechanical violence occurring just a few hundred feet away. The carrier was consuming resources at a staggering rate. In the last 15 minutes, the ship had burned through 12,000 gallons of JP-5 aviation fuel and launched over 40 interceptor missiles. The replenishment at sea vessels were still hours away, meaning the Lincoln had to rely entirely on what was already in its belly. The tactical action officer in the Combat Direction Center monitored the Winchester reports, the signals that an aircraft or weapon system was out of ammunition. Growler 2-1 is Winchester on jamming flares. Hornet 3-4 is requesting immediate recovery for refueling, the radio operator reported. The recovery of aircraft during a swarm attack was one of the most dangerous maneuvers a carrier could execute. The ship had to maintain a steady course and speed to allow the jets to trap on the wires, making the Lincoln a more predictable target for the remaining Chinese boats. The commanding officer had to balance the need to keep his pilots in the air against the need to keep the ship maneuvering defensively. It was a calculation made in seconds, with thousands of lives hanging in the balance. At coordinates 14 degrees 45 minutes north and 115 degrees 38 minutes east, the carrier strike group was a machine working at maximum capacity. The logistics of the battle were holding, but the strain was visible on the faces of the crew. Sweat ran down necks despite the cool air of the lower decks, and hands were stained with the black grease of ammunition crates. They were feeding the fortress, ensuring that when the next wave of the swarm arrived, the Lincoln would have the teeth to bite back. 5:15 in the morning. The South China Sea was illuminated by the first true light of dawn, revealing a horizon jagged with the black smoke of burning ships. The air over Carrier Strike Group 3 was no longer just a defensive space. It had become a hunting ground for the United States Navy's premier strike platform. 12 F/A-18 Super Hornets from Strike Fighter Squadron 115 had reached their designated attack positions 30 miles north of the carrier, transitioning from their holding patterns into a lethal descent toward the waves. The aircraft were configured specifically for the maritime strike role, each carrying a mix of AGM-65 Maverick missiles and GBU-54 laser joint direct attack munitions. Working in close coordination with the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye orbiting above, the pilots slaved their infrared targeting pods to the high-speed radar signatures of the northern Chinese group. The air in the cockpits was filled with the rhythmic, mechanical breathing of the pilots through their oxygen masks. A calm and professional contrast to the violent reality unfolding on the surface below. At coordinates 14 degrees 52 minutes north and 115 degrees 45 minutes east, the lead Super Hornet, callsign Talon 1, initiated the engagement. The pilots stabilized the infrared sensor on a Type 022 fast attack craft that was attempting to execute a sharp turn. The Maverick missile was released with a sharp metallic clunk, its rocket motor igniting instantly to propel the weapon toward the target at over 1,000 kilometers per second. The Maverick missile, guided by its high-resolution imaging infrared seeker, impacted the Chinese vessel directly amidships. The 300-pound shaped charge warhead punched through the thin aluminum hull and detonated inside the forward missile magazine. A massive column of white fire and debris was thrown 300 feet into the air as the vessel was literally blown in half. The two sections of the catamaran drifted apart for several seconds before slipping beneath the whitecaps, leaving nothing behind but a widening patch of burning oil and foam. Simultaneously, two EA-18 Gulf Growlers began their high-intensity electronic attack. Their jamming pods focused a concentrated beam of electromagnetic energy onto the central group of Chinese fast attack craft. The objective was to sever the data links between the boats and their shore-based command centers. The effect was immediate. The Chinese formation, which had been moving with synchronized precision, began to scatter. Without their shared tactical picture, the individual boat captains were forced to rely on their own limited sensors, which were already being blinded by the American jamming. Talon 2 is in. Fox 2 on target 3, the wingman reported over the encrypted link. Another Maverick missile shrieked across the water, slamming into the bridge of a second catamaran. The impact sent a spray of glass and jagged metal across the deck, killing the command crew instantly. The boat, its steering gear locked in a hard starboard turn, began to circle aimlessly at 45 knots, a ghost ship trailing fire and black smoke. The Super Hornets then moved into the strafing phase of the attack, utilizing their M61 At-2 Vulcan 20mm cannons. The pilots dove from 3,000 feet. The sound of the 6-barrel Gatling guns, a low, vibrating growl that could be heard even over the roar of the jet engines. Thousands of armor-piercing incendiary rounds tore into the remaining boats of the northern group, shredding the light hulls and igniting the high-speed diesel fuel stored in the catamaran's pontoons. By 5:25 in the morning, the northern pincer of the Chinese swarm had been effectively neutralized. 6 of the 8 vessels were either sunk or burning uncontrollably, while the remaining 2 had turned north, attempting to flee toward the mainland. The central group, under constant pressure from the Growler's jamming and the strafing runs of the Super Hornets, was no longer a cohesive threat. The environment of the South China Sea had been transformed. The quiet, dark morning had been replaced by a scene of industrial-scale destruction. The smell of burning chemicals and salt spray was thick in the air, and the surface of the water was littered with the wreckage of a failed ambition. However, as the air wing began to regroup, a new report from the Combat Direction Center reached the pilots. Talon led, be advised. We have a pop-up group of 4 hulls breaking from the central cluster. They are on a maximum speed intercept course for the carrier's stern. They are inside the inner defensive ring. You are cleared to engage, but watch your backstop. The Lincoln is directly behind the targets. The air wing turned their noses south, their afterburners kicking in with a twin roar of orange flame. The battle was moving into its final, most dangerous phase, where the speed of the aircraft and the desperation of the remaining attackers would collide at the very doorstep of the USS Abraham Lincoln. 5:30 in the morning, the South China Sea, exactly 4 miles off the stern of the USS Abraham Lincoln. The final remnants of the Chinese swarm, a group of 4 Type 022 fast attack craft, emerged from a wall of black smoke and sea spray. They were operating at the absolute mechanical limits of their engines, their catamaran hulls leaping over the 3-meter swells as they closed the distance at 60 knots. This was the last-ditch maneuver of a dying formation, a high-speed charge intended to strike the carrier from its most vulnerable vector. At coordinates 14 degrees 48 minutes north and 115 degrees 41 minutes east, the tactical environment tightened into a knife-fight range. The USS Abraham Lincoln was still in a hard overturn, its massive hull heeling to 15 degrees, which exposed the less protection sections of its stern to the approaching threat. The air behind the carrier was a churning mix of salt-heavy mist and the hot, sulfurous wake of the ship's 4 massive propellers. The 4 Chinese boats had entered the innermost defensive ring, a distance of less than 3,000 yards, where the heavy 5-inch guns of the escorts could no longer effectively track the targets. The defense of the carrier now rested entirely on the automated systems of the ship's own point defense network. The Phalanx close-in weapon system mounts on the carrier's aft fantail began their automated search and destroy sequence. The radar arrays on top of the white, dome-shaped mounts tracked the lead boat with a predatory, mechanical precision. Suddenly, the 20mm Vulcan cannon erupted with a deafening, continuous roar that sounded like a giant sheet of heavy metal being torn in half. White-hot tracer rounds, firing at a rate of 75 rounds per second, stitched a line of angry red fire across the dark water directly toward the approaching lead catamaran. The stream of armor-piercing tungsten rounds punched through the forward superstructure of the lead Chinese boat, shredding the bridge and the missile control station in a fraction of a second. The kinetic energy of the impact was so immense that the bow of the vessel was literally ground apart into a cloud of aluminum dust and gray spray. A split second later, the vessel's forward missile canister ignited, sending a secondary explosion through the hull that sent the entire forward deck flying into the air. The heat blast from the explosion washed across the surface of the sea, bleaching the surrounding water white for several hundred feet in every direction. The second and third Chinese boats attempted to veer away from the destruction of their leader, their rudders kicking hard to port, but they were already trapped in the turbulent wash of the carrier's massive wake. The boiling water stripped the light vessels of their speed, making them easy targets for the ship's second line of defense. A rolling airframe missile launched from the aft starboard sponson, its rocket motor screaming as it drove straight into the engine room of the second boat. The vessel erupted instantly, the sound of the detonation, a heavy, bone-shaking thud that compressed the chests of the sailors watching from the carrier's hangar bay doors. The third boat, its engines failing under the strain of the high-speed maneuvers, was caught by a concentrated burst from the carrier's portside 25mm chain gun. The heavy rounds severed the boat's fuel lines and ignited the high-speed diesel tanks, turning the catamaran into a floating funeral pyre of orange flame and black, oily smoke. The fourth and final boat, seeing the total annihilation of its companions, executed a desperate, uncontrolled turn to the east, but it was already too late. The Air Wing Super Hornets, descending from the clouds above, finished the engagement with a final strafing run that tore the remaining hull into 3 distinct pieces. The immediate aftermath was a scene of absolute silence following the mechanical violence. The sound of the close-in weapon system ceased as abruptly as it had started, leaving only the whistling of the wind over the flight deck and the deep, low thrum of the carrier's 2 nuclear reactors. Black smoke rose from 4 separate points in the water behind the Lincoln, drifting slowly across the path of the rising sun. The sea was a graveyard of twisted aluminum, burning diesel fuel, and hissing wreckage that was quickly being swallowed by the carrier's massive wake. Inside the Combat Direction Center, the tactical displays finally turned from a chaotic field of red icons to a clear, blue screen. The swarm had been broken. The breach had been repelled. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and burnt propellant. A sharp reminder of how close the carrier had come to the brink. The tactical action officer wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at the clock. The entire engagement, from the first contact to the final explosion, had lasted exactly 52 minutes. 5:45 in the morning. The South China Sea. The USS Abraham Lincoln slowed to 15 knots. Its 4 massive bronze propellers creating a less violent wake. As the immediate tactical threat dissolved into the rising sun, the horizon was no longer a clear line, but a jagged gallery of black smoke columns, each one marking the funeral pyre of a Chinese fast attack craft. At coordinates 14 degrees 50 minutes north and 115 degrees 45 minutes east, the Carrier Strike Group began the somber and methodical process of damage assessment and search and rescue. The initial report from the carrier's medical department was remarkably light, a testament to the effectiveness of the ship's defensive layers and the discipline of the crew. 3 sailors on the starboard weapon sponson had suffered second-degree flash burns from the intense heat of the rolling airframe missile launches, and 1 petty officer had been injured by a fall during the high-speed maneuvers. On the destroyer DDG-87, 2 personnel were treated for smoke inhalation after a near miss from a Chinese cruise missile caused a localized electrical fire in a secondary radar compartment. The professional medical teams of the United States Navy worked with quiet efficiency, stabilizing the injured and preparing them for further evaluation. The Lincoln itself bore the visible scars of the close-in engagement. The starboard side paint was scorched and blackened by the rapid fire of its own point defense systems, and a small section of the flight deck safety netting had been shredded by supersonic fragments from a neutralized YJ-83 missile. The cruiser CG-62 reported minor shrapnel damage to its forward superstructure, but its primary combat systems remained fully operational. No American hull had been breached. and the strike group's nuclear propulsion systems were functioning at peak efficiency, proving the resilience of the carrier's design under direct attack. The cost for the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy was catastrophic and absolute. Of the 24 Type 022 fast attack craft that had initiated the breach, 19 had been confirmed sunk by a combination of surface fire and precision airstrikes. 3 more were dead in the water, their hulls gutted by fire, and their crews attempting to abandon ship into the oil-slicked swells. The remaining 2 vessels had been tracked by the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye as they fled at high speed toward the northwest, disappearing into the radar clutter of the Chinese coastline. The water was littered with the remnants of the swarm, a floating graveyard of twisted aluminum and charred equipment. The morning air was heavy with the smell of burnt cordite, scorched aluminum, and the thick, cloying scent of unrefined diesel fuel. Scorched aluminum and the thick, cloying scent of unrefined diesel fuel. The sun, now clearing the horizon, cast a long, golden light over the vast debris field that stretched for several miles. Thousands of pieces of charred wreckage, from orange life rafts to jagged hull plates, bobbed in the carrier's wake, hissing as the cold seawater hit the hot metal. The sea, which had been a violent battlefield only minutes ago, was now a vast crime scene under the watchful eyes of the orbiting Super Hornets. On the bridge of the Lincoln, the commanding officer surveyed the scene with a grim, professional focus. The immediate tactical victory was decisive, but the strategic silence from the Chinese mainland was a cause for concern. The carrier strike group maintained its high alert status, its sensors still scanning for any sign of a follow-up strike from land-based bombers or submarines. The crew remained at their battle stations, the adrenaline of the fight replaced by the steady, focused resolve of sailors who knew the mission was not yet over. The logistics of the aftermath were already in motion. The MH-60 Sierra helicopters were hovering over the debris, their crews looking for survivors among the wreckage, though the violence of the explosions suggested few would be found. The destroyer DDG-87 moved to provide a screen for the rescue operations, its guns still manned and ready. The United States Navy had held the line, but the geopolitical implications of this failed breach would be analyzed in Washington and Beijing for years to come. 6:30 in the morning. The South China Sea and the headquarters of Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii. The USS Abraham Lincoln had resumed its original heading, its speed steady at 25 knots. The morning sun was now fully above the horizon, reflecting off a sea that was deceptively calm, showing no traces of the fire and metal that had filled it only 2 hours prior. A high-priority encrypted data burst was transmitted from the carrier's satellite array, containing the definitive situation report for the engagement at coordinates 14 degrees 55 minutes north and 115 degrees 50 minutes east. The report to Indo-Pacific Command was a cold, clinical summary of a failed asymmetric assault. The commander of Carrier Strike Group 3 confirmed that the threat from the Chinese fast attack swarm had been entirely neutralized. Of the 24 Type 022 hulls involved in the breach attempt, 19 were confirmed as total losses, sunk by a combination of surface fire and air-to-surface missiles. 3 additional vessels were categorized as mission killed, adrift, and burning, while only 2 had successfully retreated into the radar clutter of the mainland. The aggressive attempt to saturate the carrier's defenses had resulted in the near-total destruction of a specialized naval unit. For the United States Navy, the engagement was a decisive validation of its layered defense doctrine and the professionalism of its sailors. The USS Abraham Lincoln remained fully mission-capable, with its nuclear propulsion system, primary radar arrays, and flight deck operations at 100% effectiveness. The destroyer DDG-87 and the cruiser CG-62 had returned to their screening stations, their Mark 41 vertical launch systems already being assessed for replenishment. Total American casualties were listed as 11 personnel injured, with 3 sailors receiving treatment for non-life-threatening burns, and 8 others treated for minor shrapnel wounds and smoke inhalation. The strategic implications of the battle were already being analyzed at the highest levels of the Department of Defense. The swarm tactic, long considered a potential carrier killer by regional adversaries, had failed to penetrate, the innermost ring of the Aegis combat system. The combination of electronic jamming from the EA-18 Golf Growlers, precision strikes from the Super Hornets, and the automated lethality of the close-in weapon systems had created a kill zone that the Chinese vessels could not survive. The myth of the low-cost swarm defeating the high-cost carrier had been tested in the crucible of real combat and found wanting. The environment around the strike group was now peaceful, the morning air clear and smelling of the clean salt of the deep ocean. The smell of burning diesel and cordite had been scrubbed away by the 30-knot wind of the carrier's forward motion. On the flight deck, the yellow shirts were already moving the next cycle of aircraft into position for a routine combat air patrol. The rhythm of the ship had returned to its professional baseline, a city of 5,000 souls moving as one toward its next objective. Strike Group 3 remains on station. Freedom of navigation is maintained, the final line of the report read. As the message was received, in Hawaii and Washington, the USS Abraham Lincoln disappeared into the vast blue expanse of the Pacific. Its wake, a long, straight line of white foam. The engagement was a reminder to the world that while the technology of war had changed, the resolve and capability of the United States Navy remained the dominant force on the high seas. The carrier was not just a ship, it was a sovereign piece of American territory, and as the 24 charred wrecks settling on the seafloor proved, it was a territory that could not be breached.